March 2019. The morning fog hung thick over the parking lot of St. Augustine's Parish in Chicago's South Side, turning the familiar red brick building into something distant and dreamlike. 3 unmarked police vehicles rolled silently into the spaces near the community center entrance at 6:47 a.m. Inside, 76-year-old Robert Mitchell was arranging folding chairs for the weekly senior breakfast club, the same volunteer work he had done faithfully every Wednesday for the past 12 years. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the empty hall at 6:52 a.m., followed by the reading of rites that would shatter a community's trust. What began as a routine morning of service transformed into the resolution of a 56-year-old mystery that had haunted Chicago's Bridgeport neighborhood since the Kennedy administration. If you're interested in true crime cases with the details that mainstream coverage leaves out, hit that like button and subscribe, because what we're about to reveal will change everything. You thought you knew about this case. Margaret Ellen Hayes was born on April 3, 1944, in Cook County Hospital to Thomas Patrick Hayes, a machinist at the Pullman Railway Works, and Dorothy May Hayes, a seamstress who took in alterations from their kitchen table. The second of 4 children, Margaret grew up in a cramped but loving 3-bedroom bungalow on South Halsted Street, sharing a room with her younger sister, Patricia. Standing at 5 feet 4 inches with honey blonde hair that caught the afternoon sun streaming through the parish windows, Margaret possessed an infectious laugh that her childhood friend Susan O'Connell remembered decades later. "Maggie had this way of making everyone feel like they mattered," Susan recalled in a 2018 interview. "She'd remember your birthday, ask about your sick grandmother, bring you soup when you had a cold. She was the glue that held our whole youth group together." Margaret's defining physical feature was a dimple on her left cheek that appeared only when she smiled genuinely, something her mother said happened approximately 100 times a day. A small crescent-shaped birthmark on her right wrist looked remarkably like a tiny moon, which Margaret told friends was her lucky mark. She wore cat-eye reading glasses that she considered fashionable, though she only needed them for extended reading sessions. Margaret dreamed of becoming a teacher, specifically wanting to work with children who struggled with reading, having tutored younger neighborhood kids throughout her high school years at Nativity of Our Lord Catholic School. In the fall of 1963, she had just begun her freshman year at Chicago Teachers College, commuting daily via the Chicago Transit Authority. Her typical routine involved attending morning classes, working afternoon shifts at Woolworth's Five and Dime store on 35th Street, and attending evening youth group meetings at St. Augustine's every Tuesday and Thursday. Father Bernard Kowalski, the parish priest, described her as a young woman of deep faith and deeper compassion, the kind of parishioner who restored your belief in humanity's goodness. The Hayes family lived modestly on Thomas's $87 weekly salary, but Margaret's father worked double shifts to ensure all his children could pursue education. Margaret herself contributed her Woolworth's earnings, approximately $32 weekly, to a savings account she called her Someday Fund, money she hoped would help her finish college and perhaps travel to see the ocean, something she had never done. Bridgeport in 1963 was a neighborhood of 61,000 residents, predominantly Irish and Polish Catholic families who had lived there for generations, their lives revolving around parish boundaries and union halls. The community stretched roughly from 26th Street South to 35th Street, bounded by the South Branch of the Chicago River to the west and the Dan Ryan Expressway construction to the east. Working-class families occupied neat rows of brick bungalows and 2 flats, their front stoops serving as summer living rooms where neighbors discussed White Sox games and union negotiations at the nearby stockyards. In 1963, the stockyards still employed over 25,000 workers, and the smell of livestock hung perpetually in the air, a scent that residents claimed they no longer noticed. The political climate was intense, with Mayor Richard J. Daley, himself a Bridgeport native, consolidating his power over the city's democratic machine. The neighborhood took fierce pride in their mayor, displaying Daley for Mayor signs year-round, not just during election season. St. Augustine's Parish stood as the neighborhood's spiritual and social center, its limestone facade and twin bell towers visible from blocks away. The parish operated an elementary school attended by 847 children, a high school with 423 students, and ran numerous social programs including youth groups, ladies' sodalities, men's holy name society, and charitable outreach. Social life in Bridgeport revolved around these parish activities: church basement bingo games, CYO basketball tournaments, and Friday night fish fries during Lent. On November 22, 1963, the neighborhood shared the nation's shock when President Kennedy was assassinated, with special memorial masses held for weeks afterward. The community's working-class identity meant most families knew financial hardship, but maintained strict codes about respectability, hard work, and looking after your own. Trust was paramount. People left doors unlocked, children played unsupervised until streetlights came on, and a handshake sealed agreements. This tight-knit quality would make what happened to Margaret Hayes even more incomprehensible. November 14, 1963, began as an ordinary Thursday for Margaret Ellen Hayes, though it would be her last. 7:15 a.m. Margaret ate breakfast with her family, oatmeal with brown sugar and a glass of orange juice, her usual meal before classes. Her mother Dorothy remembered Margaret wearing her favorite navy blue cardigan over a white blouse and a grey wool skirt, modest attire appropriate for both college and her retail job. 7:52 a.m. Margaret boarded the southbound bus at the Halsted Street stop, witnessed by elderly neighbor Mrs. Greta Kowalski, who waved from her window as she did every morning. 8:30 a.m. Margaret arrived at Chicago Teachers College and attended her English literature class, where Professor Donald Armstrong marked her present and later recalled she participated in a discussion about Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. 10:15 a.m. Margaret was seen in the campus library by fellow student Janet Morrison, studying at her usual table near the periodicals section. 12:30 p.m. Margaret ate lunch in the campus cafeteria with three classmates, Ruth Anderson, Beverly Parks, and Linda Chen, discussing their upcoming Thanksgiving plans. She was excited about her aunt making sweet potato pie, Ruth Anderson testified in 1964. She seemed completely normal, happy even. 2:45 p.m. Margaret left campus, telling her friend Beverly she was heading to her shift at Woolworths. 3:20 p.m. Margaret clocked in at Woolworths, verified by the time card that would later become evidence, working her assigned station at the cosmetics counter. 6:00 p.m. Margaret clocked out, her supervisor, Mrs. Helen Walsh, noting nothing unusual about her demeanor. 6:15 p.m. Margaret was seen walking north on Halsted Street by grocery store owner Mr. Vincent Palermo, who called out a greeting which Margaret returned with her characteristic smile. 6:40 p.m. Margaret told her co-worker Sarah Jenkins she was heading directly to youth group at St. Augustine's, mentioning they were planning the Christmas pageant. 7:00 p.m. Youth group was scheduled to begin, but Margaret never arrived. Father Kowalski remembered checking his watch at 7:15 p.m., noting Margaret's unusual absence since she had never missed a meeting without calling. This was the last verified sighting of Margaret Ellen Hayes alive. November 15, 1963, 6:45 a.m. Dorothy Hayes called the police when she discovered Margaret's bed untouched, her daughter having never come home. At 7:30 a.m., patrol officers Dennis Murphy and Frank Castellano began checking Margaret's known route between Woolworths and St. Augustine's, a distance of approximately 8 blocks. At 2:17 p.m., 12-year-old Timothy O'Brien and his brother James were cutting through the vacant lot behind the abandoned Muller Furniture Warehouse on South Union Avenue when they discovered Margaret's body partially concealed behind a stack of discarded wooden pallets. The Cook County Medical Examiner, Dr. Raymond Foster, arrived at 3:05 p.m. and conducted a preliminary examination at the scene. Margaret had been strangled with a ligature, later determined to be a common clothesline rope, and the attack showed signs of significant struggle. Her navy cardigan was torn at the shoulder seam, 3 buttons missing from her white blouse, and defensive wounds marked both her hands, indicating she had fought desperately for her life. The medical examiner estimated time of death between 7 p.m. and 9 p.m. on November 14th. Evidence collected at the scene included Margaret's brown leather purse found 15 feet from her body, contents intact including $4, 23 in her wallet, ruling out robbery as a motive. Fragments of blue paint under her fingernails, suggesting she had scratched a painted surface during the attack. A partial shoe print in the muddy ground, size 10 men's work boot, a cigarette butt, Pall Mall brand, found 6 feet from the body. Strands of dark hair clutched in Margaret's left hand, her cat-eye reading glasses, one lens shattered, discovered near the alley entrance, and ligature marks on her wrists indicating she had been briefly restrained before the fatal strangulation. Detective Lieutenant Walter Novak, who had worked homicides for 19 years, told reporters this was a crime of opportunity that became personal. The level of violence suggests rage, but the location suggests the perpetrator knew the area intimately. The vacant lot was not visible from surrounding streets and was known primarily to neighborhood residents as a shortcut, though parents warned children against using it after dark. St. Augustine's church bells rang at 4 p.m., as they did every day, but this time they seemed to toll differently, marking the moment when Bridgeport lost its innocence. Within hours, every porch light on South Halsted Street burned brightly, an unspoken neighborhood agreement that darkness would not be allowed to hide. Are you watching this from a small town or a big city? No matter where we live, crimes like Margaret's remind us that evil doesn't discriminate by geography. Drop a comment below telling us where you're from. The Chicago Police Department's Area 1 Detective Division, in 1963, consisted of 14 detectives covering the entire South Side, each man carrying caseloads that would be considered impossible by modern standards. Lead Detective Walter Novak partnered with Detective James Sullivan to head the investigation, working with limited technological resources that now seem almost primitive. Fingerprint analysis existed, but required manual comparison against physical card files, a process taking weeks. Blood typing could establish basic categories, but not individual identification. Photography was limited to black and white film that required chemical processing. No DNA analysis, no digital databases, no cell phone records, no surveillance cameras existed to aid their work. The investigation focused initially on 5 primary suspects, each with apparent motive and opportunity. Robert James Mitchell, age 20, worked as a maintenance assistant at St. Augustine's Parish, responsible for minor repairs, groundskeeping, and setting up for events. His connection to Margaret was through the youth group, where he occasionally helped move furniture and equipment for their activities. Several youth group members, including Margaret's friend Susan O'Connell, mentioned that Mitchell seemed to watch Margaret more than necessary, though they characterized it as awkward shyness rather than threatening behavior. Bobby was quiet, almost painfully so, Susan stated in her 1963 interview. He'd turn red if you spoke directly to him. So investigators discovered Mitchell lived with his widowed mother in a basement apartment 3 blocks from the crime scene, had no criminal record, and was described by Father Kowalski as a gentle soul, perhaps simple, but absolutely harmless. Mitchell's alibi placed him at home with his mother the entire evening of November 14th, corroborated by neighbors who heard their television playing continuously. However, detectives noted the apartment's back entrance opened onto an alley, meaning he could have left undetected. Mitchell voluntarily provided hair samples and submitted to multiple interrogations, maintaining his innocence while appearing genuinely distraught about Margaret's death. The investigation ultimately cleared him. When his hair samples didn't match those found at the scene, Thomas Edward Brennan, age 23, managed the Woolworth store where Margaret worked and became suspect number 2 after employees reported his overly familiar behavior toward female staff, particularly younger workers. Helen Walsh, the floor supervisor, told detectives that Brennan had repeatedly asked Margaret to join him for after-work coffee, invitations she politely declined. Margaret was professional, but you could tell she was uncomfortable, Walsh stated. She started timing her breaks to avoid being alone in the back room with him. Brennan was married with a 6-month-old daughter, but worked evening shifts that his wife Diane confirmed, often ran late. On November 14th, Brennan claimed he worked until 8:30 p.m. doing inventory, then drove directly home, arriving around 9:01 p.m. His wife initially supported this timeline, but under pressure admitted she had been asleep when he arrived, and only assumed it was around 9 because that's when he usually gets home. Store inventory records showed discrepancies that Brennan attributed to sloppy record-keeping by previous managers. Detectives found Brennan's defensive and evasive during questioning, but physical evidence didn't support his involvement. He wore size 8, 5 shoes, too small for the boot print found at the scene, and his hair was distinctly red, not matching the dark strands recovered from Margaret's hand. By January 1964, investigators concluded Brennan was likely guilty of inappropriate workplace behavior, but not murder. Vincent Paul Caruso, age 31, owned Caruso's Tap, a neighborhood bar located 2 blocks from the crime scene, and emerged as suspect 3 due to his criminal history and proximity. Caruso had served 18 months in Joliet Correctional Center from 1957 to 1958 for aggravated assault following a bar fight that nearly killed another man. Multiple witnesses, including regular patron Stanley Wojcik, placed Caruso at his own bar throughout the evening of November 14th, serving customers and tending bar alongside his brother Anthony. Vinny never left from behind that bar, Wojcik told police. I was there from 6 until closing at 2 a.m. He was pouring drinks the whole time. Despite the solid alibi, detectives pursued Caruso aggressively due to his violent history and noted hot temper. Search warrants for his residence and the bar's storage areas yielded no evidence connecting him to Margaret. Caruso's attorney, Morton Fleischer, filed harassment complaints after the 7th round of questioning, and by March 1964, police acknowledged Caruso's alibis were unbreakable. David Allen Porter, age 17, was Margaret's classmate at Chicago Teachers College and became suspect 4 after coming forward with information he initially withheld. Porter admitted he had harbored romantic feelings for Margaret and had followed her from campus on November 14th, intending to ask her on a date. I was shy. I kept trying to work up the courage, Porter told detectives through tears. I followed her to Woolworths and waited outside like some kind of creep. When she came out and started walking, I still couldn't do it. I watched her turn the corner onto Union Avenue and I just went home. Porter's confession to following Margaret made him a prime suspect until his timeline fell apart under scrutiny. He claimed he had turned around and caught a bus home at approximately 6:30 p.m., arriving at his parents' residence in Hyde Park by 7:15 p.m. His mother, Elizabeth Porter, confirmed her son arrived home around dinner time and stayed in all evening, working on a term paper she could hear him typing in his room. The typing detail proved crucial because Porter used an electric typewriter, and his paper, time-stamped by his professor when submitted November 15th, showed formatting inconsistencies indicating it had been typed in one continuous session, supporting his alibi. Hair samples from Porter, a blonde, didn't match evidence, and his shoes were size 9. Inconsistent with the boot print, the 5th suspect, and perhaps the most investigated, was Gerald Francis Murphy, age 27, a stockyard worker who lived in a boarding house on South Emerald Avenue, just 4 blocks from where Margaret's body was discovered. Murphy had no direct connection to Margaret, but became a person of interest after landlady Mrs. Agnes Kowalski reported to police that he had arrived home around 8:30 p.m. on November 14th, with mud on his work boots and what appeared to be scratches on his face. Murphy claimed the scratches came from loading cattle at the stockyards, an explanation his supervisor, Martin O'Malley, partially corroborated, stating that Murphy had worked a full shift that day from 7 a.m. until 5 p.m. However, this left several unaccounted hours between the end of his shift and his return home. Murphy told detectives he had stopped at 3 different taverns after work, having drinks at each location, but could only specifically name 2 establishments and bartenders who remembered serving him. I was just blowing off steam after a hard week, Murphy stated during his 4th interrogation. I probably hit 5 or 6 bars. I don't remember all of them. I do that every Thursday. Detectives found Murphy's vagueness suspicious and noted his increasingly hostile attitude during questioning. He refused to provide hair samples initially, relenting only after his court-appointed attorney advised cooperation. The hair analysis proved inconclusive, with laboratory technician Dr. Morris Goldstein noting that the samples were possibly similar but not definitively matched, given the limitations of microscopic comparison available in 1963. Murphy's work boots were size 10, consistent with the crime scene print, but investigators found no traces of blue paint matching the fragments under Margaret's fingernails. A search of Murphy's boarding house room revealed nothing incriminating beyond several true crime magazines, which Murphy's attorney argued were common reading material. By summer 1964, despite Detective Novak's conviction that Murphy warranted continued surveillance, the evidence remained circumstantial. Without physical proof or witness testimony placing Murphy at the crime scene, the state's attorney declined to pursue charges. The Margaret Hayes investigation consumed over 3,000 man-hours between November 1963 and December 1964, with detectives interviewing 247 individuals, generating 1,400 pages of reports and following 89 separate leads. By January 1965, with no arrests and no new evidence, the case was transferred from active investigation to the cold case files, assigned a reference number of CC63-1847. The last significant investigative activity occurred on November 14, 1965, the second anniversary of Margaret's death, when Detective Novak personally reviewed the entire case file, adding a note that read, "This murder is solvable. Someone in Bridgeport knows what happened. Time will bring truth." The case was officially classified as inactive in March 1966. What time is it where you're watching this? For the Hayes family, time stopped at 6:40 p.m. on November 14, 1963, and wouldn't start moving again for 56 years. Thomas Patrick Hayes never fully recovered from losing his daughter. The 51-year-old machinist, who had worked double shifts to fund Margaret's education, found himself unable to concentrate at work, his hands shaking when operating machinery that required absolute precision. By February 1964, his supervisor at Pullman transferred him to a less demanding position in inventory management with reduced pay. Thomas transformed his grief into obsessive action, creating what his wife Dorothy called the wall in their basement, a pegboard covered with newspaper clippings, police reports, maps, photographs, and handwritten notes tracking every detail of the investigation. He would go down there every night after dinner, Dorothy recalled in a 2001 interview, her voice still breaking. I'd hear him moving things around, muttering to himself, trying to solve what the police couldn't. It consumed him until the day he died. Thomas spent countless hours walking the route between Woolworths and St. Augustine's, measuring distances, timing different pathways, questioning anyone who might have seen something. He attended every court hearing for every crime in Bridgeport, convinced the perpetrator might be caught for something else. Thomas Patrick Hayes died of a heart attack on June 3, 1987, at age 75, having spent 24 years searching for his daughter's killer. At his funeral, Father Michael Brennan, who had replaced the retired Father Kowalski, noted that Thomas was buried holding a photograph of Margaret from her high school graduation. Dorothy May Hayes channeled her anguish differently, throwing herself into volunteer work with victims' families through a support group formed at St. Augustine's in 1965. She became a fierce advocate for other mothers who had lost children to violence, attending trials, writing letters to politicians demanding better police resources, and organizing annual memorial masses for unsolved murder victims. I couldn't bring Maggie back, but I could sit with other mothers and tell them they weren't alone in this hell, Dorothy told a Chicago Tribune reporter in 1989. Despite her public strength, family members knew Dorothy kept Margaret's bedroom exactly as it had been. Her daughter's navy cardigan still hanging in the closet, her textbook still stacked on the desk, her cat-eye reading glasses still resting on the nightstand. Dorothy refused to wash Margaret's pillowcase for 3 years, claiming she could still smell her daughter's Prell shampoo. She developed a ritual of attending 6:40 p.m. Mass every Thursday, the exact time Margaret had last been seen alive, sitting in the same pew where her daughter had sat for youth group meetings. Dorothy May Hayes lived until November 2009, reaching age 87, having spent 46 years waiting for answers that would come too late for her to hear them. Patricia Hayes, Margaret's younger sister, who was 15 at the time of the murder, struggled with survivor's guilt and developed severe anxiety that required psychiatric treatment throughout her teenage years. Patricia had asked Margaret to skip youth group that Thursday evening and attend a school basketball game with her instead, an invitation Margaret declined because she had committed to helping plan the Christmas pageant. I spent decades thinking, if I had just convinced her to come with me, she'd still be alive, Patricia shared in a 2018 support group meeting. Patricia became a social worker, specializing in trauma counseling, earning her degree from Loyola University in 1971, directly attributing her career choice to her sister's murder. She married Robert Chen in 1973 and moved to Evanston, deliberately putting distance between herself and Bridgeport, though she returned every November 14th to place flowers at the memorial stone St. Augustine's had installed in Margaret's memory. Patricia never had children, later admitting she feared bringing life into a world that had taken her sister so violently. Margaret's two brothers, Thomas Jr., aged 22 in 1963, and William, aged 13, each bore their own scars. Thomas Jr. had been serving in the United States Army, stationed in Germany when Margaret was killed. The Red Cross notification reached him on November 16th, but military transport delays meant he didn't arrive home until November 22nd, missing his sister's funeral by one day. "I wasn't there when she needed protection, and I wasn't there to say goodbye," Thomas Jr. told a Veterans Affairs counselor in 1971. He completed his military service but struggled with alcohol abuse upon returning to civilian life, cycling through various jobs and 2 failed marriages. In 1979, Thomas Jr. achieved sobriety through Alcoholics Anonymous and spent his remaining years volunteering with Big Brothers Big Sisters, mentoring young men from troubled backgrounds. He died in 2003 at age 62 from complications related to emphysema. William Hayes, the youngest sibling, was only 13 when he lost the sister who had helped him with homework and taught him to ride a bicycle. William became withdrawn and angry, getting into frequent fights at school, his grades plummeting from B's to D's within a single semester. A concerned teacher, Mrs. Ruth Goldman, intervened in 1965, spending extra time with William and eventually helping him channel his rage into boxing at a local PAL gym. William went on to become a Chicago police officer in 1973, specifically requesting assignment to the detective division, making no secret that he hoped to one day work his sister's case. He retired as a detective sergeant in 2005, having worked hundreds of cases, but never the one that mattered most to him. In 2019, at age 69, William finally saw the resolution he had spent a lifetime pursuing. The Margaret Hayes case underwent formal review 4 times over 5 decades, each review representing renewed hope, followed by crushing disappointment. In 1975, 12 years after the murder, newly appointed Detective Commander Richard Morrison ordered cold case reviews for all unsolved homicides from the 1960s as part of a department modernization initiative. The Hayes case was reassigned to Detective Lawrence Bennett, who spent 3 months re-interviewing surviving witnesses and re-examining physical evidence. Bennett's review introduced psychological profiling techniques then gaining popularity, consulting with Dr. Howard Stein, a forensic psychiatrist at Northwestern University. Dr. Stein's profile suggested the killer was likely a white male aged 20 to 35 in 1963, someone familiar with the neighborhood who had either known Margaret personally or had observed her routinely, exhibiting signs of sexual inadequacy and difficulty forming normal relationships with women. This profile fit several of the original suspects, but provided no new investigative direction. The 1975 review concluded with a recommendation to cross-reference the Hayes case against any similar murders in surrounding jurisdictions, a task that yielded no matches. In 1989, the advent of DNA profiling technology prompted a second review. Detective Maria Delgado obtained authorization to send the preserved hair samples and biological evidence from the 1963 crime scene to the Illinois State Crime Laboratory for DNA analysis. The results proved disappointing, as the samples had degraded significantly during 26 years of storage under less than ideal conditions. Laboratory Director Dr. Patricia Wong reported that while partial DNA profiles could be extracted, they were insufficient for definitive comparison using the PCR-based testing methods available in 1989. The technology exists to solve this case, Dr. Wong wrote in her report, but the evidence quality does not meet minimum standards for reliable analysis. The 1989 review did result in one positive development when Detective Delgado located Gerald Murphy, the stockyard worker who had been a prime suspect in the original investigation, living in Gary, Indiana. DNA samples were obtained with Murphy's cooperation, but the comparison proved inconclusive due to the degraded crime scene evidence. Murphy died in 1993, taking any potential secrets to his grave. A third review in 2003 coincided with the 40th anniversary of Margaret's death and the implementation of the FBI's Combined DNA Index System database in Illinois. Detective Kevin O'Shea submitted the case evidence for advanced DNA extraction using improved techniques developed during the 1990s. The Bode Technology Laboratory in Virginia, specializing in degraded sample analysis, successfully extracted a partial YSTR profile from the hair roots recovered from Margaret's hand. This male DNA profile was entered into CODIS, but searches yielded no matches. "We have a genetic fingerprint of the killer," O'Shea explained to the Hayes family at a meeting on November 14, 2003. "We just need that person to be in the database." The limitation was that CODIS primarily contained DNA from convicted offenders, meaning the perpetrator would need to have been arrested and sampled for a subsequent crime. William Hayes, by then a detective himself, understood the implication, saying, "So we're waiting for him to commit another crime, or we're hoping he already did and just hasn't been entered yet." The fourth and final review began in January 2018 when the Cook County State's Attorney's Office established a cold case DNA task force, allocating funding for cutting-edge forensic genetic genealogy analysis. This revolutionary technique, which had made headlines by identifying the Golden State Killer in April 2018, offered new hope for unsolved cases with DNA evidence, but no database matches. Detective Sarah Martinez was assigned the Hayes case specifically because of her training in genetic genealogy techniques and her background working with the non-profit DNA Doe Project. On February 8, 2019, a Friday morning marked by temperatures hovering at 14 degrees Fahrenheit, Detective Sarah Martinez received results that would crack open a 56-year-old case. The forensic genetic genealogy analysis, conducted by Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia, had traced the DNA profile from Margaret Hayes' attacker through public genealogy databases, identifying a family lineage that led to a single individual living in Chicago. The technique worked by uploading the DNA profile to GEDmatch, a public database where users voluntarily share their genetic information to find relatives, then constructing elaborate family trees identifying common ancestors and narrowing down to potential suspects. "The moment I saw the name, my hands started shaking," Martinez recalled in a later interview. "This person had been hiding in plain sight for over 5 decades, not just in the same city, but in the same neighborhood, in the same church." The genetic genealogy had narrowed the suspects to 3 possible individuals, all distant cousins within the identified family line. Further investigation, including discrete DNA collection from discarded items, confirmed a definitive match. At 10:23 a.m., Detective Martinez walked into her commander's office and said, "I know who killed Margaret Hayes, and you're not going to believe it. Forensic genetic genealogy represents a quantum leap from traditional DNA comparison methods." Dr. C.C. Moore, chief genetic genealogist at Parabon Nanolabs who worked the Hayes case, explained the process in terms accessible to non-scientists. "Traditional DNA databases like CODIS work like fingerprint matching. They only help if the exact person is already in the system," Dr. Moore stated during a forensic science conference in 2019. "Genetic genealogy works more like finding someone through their family. We're looking for relatives, even distant ones, then using traditional genealogy to build family trees and identify who could have been in the right place at the right time." The process begins with extracting a DNA profile from crime scene evidence, then uploading that profile to public genealogy databases where millions of people have voluntarily submitted their DNA results from commercial testing companies like Ancestry and 23andMe. The system identifies genetic matches, typically 3rd or 4th cousins sharing common great-great-grandparents. Genealogists then construct detailed family trees, working forward through multiple generations to identify all descendants of those common ancestors. Dr. Jennifer Raymond, a forensic geneticist at the University of North Texas, noted that the technique's accuracy depends on database size and genealogical record quality. The more people in the database, the closer the genetic matches we can find, Dr. Raymond explained. In the Hayes case, we identified matches at the third cousin level, meaning we shared great-great-grandparents with the perpetrator. From there, it became detective work, building trees, eliminating branches, narrowing possibilities. The process differs dramatically from methods available in 1963, when microscopic hair comparison represented cutting-edge forensic science, with error rates now known to be unacceptably high. Statistics show forensic genetic genealogy achieved a 97% success rate in cases where sufficient DNA quality exists and matches appear in databases. The name that emerged from the genetic genealogy analysis sent shockwaves through the investigative team. Robert James Mitchell, the same 20-year-old maintenance assistant at St. Augustine's Parish who had been questioned and cleared in the original 1963 investigation. Now 76 years old, Mitchell had spent 56 years living less than 2 miles from where he murdered Margaret Hayes, maintaining his position at the very church where she had been headed the night he killed her. Detective Martinez's first reaction was disbelief, pulling the original case files to review how Mitchell had been eliminated as a suspect. The hair comparison from 1963, conducted through microscopic analysis, had concluded Mitchell's hair samples didn't match those found clutched in Margaret's hand. What we now know is that microscopic hair comparison, the gold standard of 1963, had massive reliability problems, explained Dr. Michael Porter, director of the Illinois State Crime Laboratory. Studies have shown error rates as high as 75%. The FBI formally acknowledged in 2015 that hair comparison testimony, given in thousands of cases over decades, was scientifically invalid. The original investigator, Detective Walter Novak, who had died in 1998, had cleared Mitchell primarily based on this faulty hair analysis and his mother's alibi. What detectives in 1963 couldn't have known was that Mitchell's widowed mother, Clara Mitchell, had early-stage dementia that the family kept hidden due to stigma surrounding mental illness. Clara's testimony about her son being home all evening was likely sincere but medically unreliable. Robert James Mitchell had not only remained at St. Augustine's Parish, but had been promoted over the decades from maintenance assistant to head of facilities management, a position he held from 1982 until his retirement in 2007. Even after retirement, Mitchell volunteered at the church 15 to 20 hours weekly, becoming such a fixture that newer parishioners assumed he had always been there. Parish records showed Mitchell had served on the parish council, coached youth basketball teams, organized the annual church carnival, and received the St. Vincent de Paul Award for Distinguished Service in 1995. Father Thomas Riley, who became pastor in 2003, described Mitchell in a 2019 statement as a man I would have trusted with my life, someone who embodied the parish's values of service and dedication. Mitchell had married Kathleen Murphy in 1969, raised 3 children, Robert Jr., Elizabeth, and Mary, all baptized and confirmed at St. Augustine's, and had 7 grandchildren who attended the parish school. His eldest daughter, Elizabeth, worked as a special education teacher, a career path remarkably similar to Margaret Hayes's aspirations. Mitchell's home on South Wallace Street, purchased in 1971, sat exactly 6 blocks from the Hayes family's former residence. He belonged to the Knights of Columbus, served on the Bridgeport Neighborhood Council, and volunteered weekly at the Greater Chicago Food Depository. His seemingly exemplary life contained no arrests, no complaints, no red flags that would have drawn investigative attention. The psychological profile of Robert Mitchell revealed a textbook case of compartmentalization, a defense mechanism allowing individuals to separate contradictory behaviors and beliefs into distinct mental categories. Dr. Helen Kaufman, a forensic psychologist who reviewed Mitchell's case for the prosecution, explained the phenomenon in her expert analysis. We see this pattern repeatedly in individuals who commit heinous acts yet maintain conventional lives, Dr. Kaufman stated. Mitchell could murder Margaret Hayes on Thursday and attend her funeral mass on Monday with genuine tears because he had effectively created 2 separate realities, In one reality, he was Bobby Mitchell, the shy maintenance worker devastated by the loss of a kind young woman. In the other, hidden reality, he was the predator who had stalked and killed her. The analysis suggested Mitchell had harbored sexual obsession with Margaret, that he simultaneously recognized as wrong and felt powerless to control. On November 14, 1963, seeing Margaret walking alone toward the church, Mitchell had followed her, possibly with only vague intentions initially. The vacant lot represented an impulsive opportunity, a moment when obsession overcame whatever moral constraints had previously held. The extreme violence of the attack, evidenced by the defensive wounds and broken glasses, indicated Margaret had fought fiercely, possibly saying things that triggered rage in Mitchell. Rejection often serves as a catalyst for violence in obsessive individuals. The level of force used to strangle her suggests he was trying to silence not just her voice but his own shame, Dr. Kaufman observed. Perhaps most disturbing were the documented instances of Mitchell inserting himself into Margaret's memory over the subsequent decades. In 1973, Mitchell volunteered to renovate the youth group meeting room, personally installing new lighting and refinishing the floors where Margaret had once planned Christmas pageants. In 1988, he organized the parish's 25th anniversary memorial mass for Margaret, giving a speech about how her death taught the community about fragility of life and importance of faith. "I think about Maggie often," Mitchell had said from the pulpit, his voice breaking with apparent emotion. "And I pray that wherever she is, she knows she's never been forgotten." In 2003, when the parish installed a memorial garden, Mitchell led the landscaping committee and personally planted a flowering dogwood tree with a plaque reading, "In memory of Margaret Ellen Hayes, forever young, forever kind." Dorothy Hayes had shaken Mitchell's hand at that ceremony, thanking him for honoring her daughter. Mitchell attended every annual memorial mass from 1964 through 2018, sitting in the back pews, occasionally speaking with the Hayes family members who still attended. William Hayes, the detective who had dedicated his career to finding his sister's killer, had conversed with Mitchell dozens of times over the years, discussing parish events and neighborhood changes, never suspecting the friendly older man was the monster he had spent his life hunting. On March 6, 2019, at precisely 6:47 a.m., Detective Sarah Martinez, along with Detectives William Chen and Marcus Thompson, executed the arrest warrant at St. Augustine's Parish Community Center. Mitchell had arrived early, as was his habit, to prepare for the senior breakfast program. When Martinez identified herself and stated the charges, one count of first-degree murder in the death of Margaret Ellen Hayes, Mitchell's first words were, "I've been waiting for this." He offered no resistance as Detective Chen applied handcuffs, reading him his Miranda rights at 6:52 a.m. Mitchell's second statement, made in the back of the unmarked police vehicle, was more chilling. "Does Dorothy know? I always hoped she would die not knowing it was me. She was such a kind woman." The comment revealed the depth of his compartmentalization, maintaining concern for the mother of the woman he had murdered. A search warrant executed at Mitchell's residence at 9:15 a.m. yielded unexpected evidence. In a locked footlocker in his basement, investigators found a shoebox containing Margaret's missing cardigan buttons, her broken cat-eye glasses lens, and photographs of Margaret clipped from old yearbooks and newspaper articles. Additionally, Mitchell had kept detailed journals spanning from 1964 to 2018, documenting his thoughts about the murder, his guilt, his rationalizations, and his growing certainty that advances in forensic science would eventually identify him. An entry from November 14, 2013, the 50th anniversary of the murder, read, "Attended the memorial mass again today. 50 years and they still don't know, but I know science is getting better. I see the news about DNA. I think about confessing, but what good would it do now? Everyone I hurt is old or dead. I'll take it to my grave and face judgment there." The journals would become crucial evidence, demonstrating consciousness of guilt. The Bridgeport community's reaction to Mitchell's arrest divided sharply along generational lines. Older residents who had known Mitchell for decades struggled to reconcile the friendly volunteer with the accused murderer. Margaret Chen, Mitchell's neighbor for 22 years, told reporters, "Bobby brought us soup when my husband had surgery. He shoveled our walk every winter without being asked. I cannot believe this is the same person. Fellow Knights of Columbus member Donald Patterson stated, I've prayed beside this man, worked charity drives with him, listened to him talk about his grandchildren. Either he's the greatest actor who ever lived, or the police have the wrong man. However, forensic evidence was irrefutable. The DNA match showed a probability of 99.9999% that the genetic material recovered from Margaret's hand belonged to Robert Mitchell. Younger parishioners who had not known Margaret personally expressed betrayal and anger. Teresa Gonzalez, whose children had been coached by Mitchell in youth basketball, said, "He was around my kids. I trusted him. Now I find out he murdered a 19-year-old girl and spent his life pretending to be someone he wasn't. It makes my skin crawl." Father Riley issued a statement saying, "We are shocked, heartbroken, and praying for both the Hayes family and the Mitchell family, who are also victims of these revelations." The parish council held an emergency meeting and voted to remove Mitchell's name from all plaques, awards, and dedications, including the memorial garden he had created. Do you think someone's good deeds can outweigh their crimes, or does evil erase everything? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. The trial of Robert James Mitchell began on October 7, 2019, in Cook County Criminal Court before Judge Catherine O'Brien. The prosecution, led by Assistant State's Attorney Jennifer Kowalski, presented overwhelming forensic evidence, including the genetic genealogy analysis, the DNA match confirmed through directly obtained samples, and Mitchell's own journals acknowledging guilt. Dr. C.C. Moore testified for 2 hours, explaining the genetic genealogy process, demonstrating how Mitchell's DNA connected to third cousins in the GED match database and how family tree construction led investigators to identify him. The defense, led by public defender Marcus Williams, did not dispute the DNA evidence, but attempted to argue that the 1963 crime occurred before Mitchell fully understood consequences of his actions due to his youth and potential developmental issues. Dr. Raymond Foster, a neuropsychologist hired by the defense, testified that brain development continues into the mid-20s and that Mitchell at age 20 may have had diminished impulse control. This argument gained little traction with the prosecution's rebuttal that Mitchell's 56 years of concealment demonstrated sophisticated understanding of wrongdoing. The most emotional testimony came from Patricia Chen, Margaret's sister, now 71 years old. Taking the stand on October 15th, Patricia spoke directly to Mitchell, stating, "You didn't just kill my sister that night. You killed my parents slowly over decades. You killed the person I might have become. You sat in the same church pews as my family. You shook our hands, you planted a tree in her memory, all while knowing you were the reason she was gone. That requires a special kind of evil I cannot comprehend." Mitchell showed no emotion during Patricia's testimony, staring at the defense table, occasionally taking notes. William Hayes, now 70, testified about the impact of his sister's murder on his life and his career in law enforcement. "I became a detective, hoping someday I'd work this case," William stated. "I attended every training on cold case investigation, every seminar on new forensic techniques. I retired in 2005 thinking I had failed Maggie. Finding out the killer was someone I had known, someone I had spoken with, someone who pretended to care, that's almost worse than never knowing." The jury deliberated for only 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on October 23, 2019. Judge O'Brien sentenced Mitchell to life imprisonment without possibility of parole, the maximum sentence available. In her sentencing remarks, Judge O'Brien stated, "Mr. Mitchell, you have lived a life of profound deception. You murdered an innocent young woman whose only crime was existing in your world. You then compounded that horror by inserting yourself into her memory, causing her family additional pain every time you pretended to honor her. The law does not allow me to sentence you to 56 consecutive life terms, one for each year you stole from Margaret and her family, but if it did, I would." The resolution of Margaret Hayes' murder catalyzed significant changes in how cold cases are approached in Illinois. In November 2019, the Illinois General Assembly passed the Margaret Hayes Cold Case Act, allocating $5 million annually for forensic genetic genealogy analysis of unsolved homicides with viable DNA evidence. The legislation, sponsored by State Representative Maria Santos, requires law enforcement agencies to submit eligible cold cases for analysis and establishes a database tracking all unsolved murders in the state. Cook County State's Attorney Kim Fox announced the Cold Case Justice Initiative, dedicating a specialized unit of 6 prosecutors and 12 investigators exclusively to cases more than 10 years old. Margaret Hayes waited 56 years for justice, Fox stated at the press conference. How many other families are waiting? How many other killers are living free, thinking they got away with it? This initiative sends a message: we will never stop looking. The case became a cornerstone in training programs for law enforcement nationwide, with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit using Mitchell's journals and behavior patterns as teaching material. His ability to maintain a conventional life while harboring such a dark secret for over 5 decades provided valuable insights into offender psychology. The Illinois State Police Crime Laboratory now dedicates 2 forensic genealogists full-time to working cold cases, having solved 18 additional murders using similar techniques. By the end of 2024, Dorothy Hayes' death in 2009 meant she never learned who killed her daughter, though Patricia Chen found small comfort in this. Mom died believing the killer would face divine justice, even if earthly justice failed, Patricia reflected. Maybe that gave her more peace than knowing it was someone she had trusted. Thomas Patrick Hayes' obsessive investigation, documented in the notebooks and files his family donated to the Chicago History Museum, proved prescient in many details. In a 1982 entry, Thomas had written a list of individuals he believed should remain under suspicion, and Robert Mitchell's name appeared, circled in red ink, with a note reading, "Cleared too quickly. Mother's alibi questionable. Access and opportunity. Knew her habits." William Hayes, asked how he felt about his father's intuition, said simply, "Dad knew. Somewhere in his gut he knew." The Hayes family established the Margaret Ellen Hayes Memorial Scholarship at Chicago Teachers College, now Chicago State University, providing full tuition for students pursuing elementary education degrees with focus on literacy. As of 2024, 37 students have graduated with the scholarship, teaching in schools across Illinois. Patricia Chen lived to see her sister's killer imprisoned, stating at Mitchell's sentencing, "This doesn't bring Maggie back, and it doesn't erase 56 years of pain, but it means my sister's death finally has an answer. It means other families have hope. That matters." If you found this deep dive into Margaret Hayes' case compelling, please subscribe to this channel for more true crime investigations that examine not just the crime, but the decades of impact and the science that finally brings justice. We cover cases that mainstream media rush through, cases that deserve to have every detail told. Share this video with anyone interested in forensic science, cold case investigation, or stories of families who never gave up. What other long unsolved cases would you like us to investigate? What questions do you still have about the Hayes case or forensic genetic genealogy? Leave your comments below, and you might see your questions answered in future videos. Margaret Ellen Hayes was 19 years old when her life was stolen, but her story doesn't end with her death. It extends through decades of family grief, through the transformation of forensic science, through a community's reckoning with trust and evil, and ultimately through a resolution that shows justice, however delayed, remains possible. Remember Margaret not just as a victim, but as the aspiring teacher who dreamed of helping struggling readers, the friend who made everyone feel valued, the daughter whose family never stopped fighting for truth. Her case reminds us that behind every cold case number is a person who mattered, a family that still grieves, and a killer who thought time would be their protection. Time, it turns out, became their enemy.